Hello everyone, and welcome to Drydock episode 133. This week, the questions are taken from the guide on USS Helena, guide 195, as well as the Wednesday video on the Queen Elizabeth class design and damage history. So, let us begin. Adam Wright asks, if Britain and Germany had gone to war 10 years earlier, so before the groundbreaking arrival of HMS Dreadnought, how do you think the two navies would have fared? It's not looking good for the Germans, shall we say. At this point, they theoretically have 14 pre-dreadnoughts in service, and they have another couple of classes underway. They've got the Braunschweigs under construction. Two of them will commission in the latter part of 1904 and the rest in 1905 and 1906. They're just in the process of laying down the Deutschland, so they're not going to be around for a little while. The problem that they have is, firstly, that of the 14 they actually have in service, all but 4 of them are armed with 9.4-inch guns and are, relatively speaking, small. And outside of the Wittelsbach class, not exactly quick either. The 4 that they have that are armed with 11-inch guns aren't actually the newest, they're the oldest, the Brandenburgs, and those are the ones with the slightly odd amidships turret with a shorter barrel set of 11-inch guns. So they actually have 6 11-inch guns, but in 2 separate barrel lengths, which is going to make gunnery even more interesting. The British, if you start at the Majestic, so you're not including the Royal Sovereigns, you're not including any of the second-class battleships, and to be honest, you probably could lump those in if you really wanted to face off against the majority of the German ships, considering the 9.4-inch guns. But regardless, just starting at the Majestics, the British have 29 battleships in service, all armed with 12-inch guns, most of which are faster than most of their German counterparts. They have another 8 in the middle of construction. That's the King Edward VII's. And cruiser-wise, the story isn't much better. The Germans have a grand total of 2 armoured cruisers, with the third one about to come online. And they have somewhere between a dozen and 2 dozen protected cruisers, depending on exactly how you classify protected cruisers. And let's just say at this point, the Royal Navy has a lot more cruisers than that. And torpedo boats, destroyers, whatever, the situation just kind of repeats itself. Submarines, of course, at this point are an incredibly experimental weapon and pretty much only really good for harbour defence, so they're really not an issue. Human-powered flight is literally just a thing, so outside of maybe the odd wandering airship, there's not a tremendous amount to be said there. So yeah, the Germans are in a far worse position than they were in 1914. If they sail out, the British don't even really have to concentrate all their fleets in home waters. Numerically and qualitatively, the Channel Fleet and the Atlantic Fleet are pretty much more than enough to overmatch the German Navy at this point. The sort of the big ticket items as far as German pre-dreadnoughts are concerned, the 2 last and large classes of pre-dreadnought, they're still under construction, or as we said, are just about to be laid down. So yeah, they're not really in a good position. The naval war is either going to be incredibly boring because the German admirals will just keep everybody at home, or very short and very bloody when they sail out. Now, the interesting thing about it is that being in 1904, this is a couple of years after the long-range gunnery revolution has kind of begun. So ranges for battle are probably going to be fought at maybe 3,000 to 6,000 yards, which is going to be a very interesting place to fight. Bearing in mind you've got the Russo-Japanese War going on at pretty much the same time. So Tsushima, Battle of the Yellow Sea, etc., they're kind of rough guides, at least to the kind of battle ranges and tactics you might see being used, especially considering that the Imperial Japanese Navy at the time was using an awful lot of Royal Navy designs and Royal Navy tactics. Where the Germans might have some individual successes, however, is that whilst the Royal Navy is gradually being dragged kicking and screaming into the concept of perhaps not keeping every single ironclad you've ever built around for reasons, they haven't quite got all the way through scrapping them, so there may be some really weird and random, at this point pretty much ancient and obsolete, ironclads and related vessels wandering around the outer environs of the British Empire, which German ships might be able to engage and take down pretty easily. But it depends on how this war breaks out, if it's a sudden war, if it's a gradual build-up of tension. Reva, commenting on the Helena video, asks, I seem to recall that this incident, was one of the Helena incidents, was far from the first time American ships hesitated at shooting their foes in a night fight. Just how often did blue-on-blue engagements actually happen in World War II, and was this an overabundance of caution or any real danger? Whilst they weren't massively frequent, the incidents of friendly fire that did happen in World War II tended to be quite devastating. Apart from anything, obviously, usually one party wasn't expecting it at all, so that was almost effectively a surprise attack without return fire, and also a lot of friendly fire incidents between ships, as opposed to aircraft versus subs, or aircraft versus ships, or ships or subs versus aircraft, etc., tended to be obviously when ships were relatively close to each other, because, they were supposed to be sailing together, which increased the lethality of the engagement even more. So you have incidents like poor old Admiral Scott getting him and most of his bridge crew end up getting killed by San Francisco's 8-inch salvos just blowing through most of Atlanta's bridge and superstructure. So, given that a lot of these incidents would happen at night, and usually at night you had an element of surprise, it was better to check your target was it actually who you thought it was before opening fire, because a night action, again, it has an extra element of surprise to it. And for a ship like Helena, if you've been watching the Guadalcanal series so far, and hopefully you'll be seeing a few more of those videos coming up soon, Helena in particular could lay down an awful lot of hurt very quickly. She, with her multiple 6-inch guns. The Brooklyn class, when it was being utilised by a good crew, was an absolutely lethal murder machine in a close-range engagement. And at that point, well, yeah, there is a small chance that if you guess wrong and it was actually an enemy, then they get the drop on you. But even then, if you're Helena, even if the enemy gets one salvo off, you're probably still got the advantage in most engagements. So it's definitely worth just going, I'm going to make sure these guys are actually enemy before we shoot at them. Thomas Laurie asks, did the Royal Navy learn enough from flying off platforms and various furniture rearranging on HMS Furious, etc. to make it worth it, or would they have been better off making a flat deck ship of whatever size and going from there? It was definitely worth it, because you've got to understand just how little was actually understood about the operations of aircraft aboard ships at the time that Furious was undergoing her many different reconstructions. And there was a certain amount of trying to extract the maximum combat value from ships as well, because to build the island, the superstructure, off to one side is actually quite a complex process for an aircraft carrier. Not only have you got to trunk all the funnels over to one side, which is completely against what everyone had been doing up to that point, and you're moving the superstructure to one side, which again was largely against naval design doctrine at the time, because you've now got a very lopsided ship balance-wise. So you've now got to make up that weight, unless you want your ship to be listing at an angle all the time, somehow. Whether that be installing extra bulges under the island and the funnel for stability, or extending the ship on the other side to induce more weight on that side, and so on and so forth. So just a flat ship with an island is complicated, and it sort of, if we don't have to do that, then we don't want to. If you're going to go with a pure flat top design, well, then you are ruling out that ship being able to do any other kind of activity, because it's not going to have gun turrets, it's not going to have a particularly good command position, because the bridge is going to be lower. There's going to be all sorts of complicated trunking with the funnels and exhaust to get the exhaust of the ship out somewhere else, which is all additional problems. So, and with the aircraft they had at the time, there was at least a possibility that they might be able to land and or take off using one end of a ship or another, which would make life a whole lot easier, because it would mean you could effectively build half or three quarters of a conventional ship and then just put a flight deck on fore or aft, which, yeah, it would be vastly easier to do, and would also retain other combat capability. So instead of having a ship, because bear in mind at this point carrier aircraft aren't really that great at strike, you can have a ship that provides scouting but is also capable of doing some of its own physical scouting and doing a bit of fighting as well. Then when they're going to fore and aft, again, you can see the benefits of if we've got a completely separate section where we can operate our aircraft taking off, and another completely separate section where we can recover them and still have our superstructure. So again, we're not having to worry about all these weird and wonderful delicate balance calculations. This is a good idea. But the various iterations of design that Furious goes through basically shows them what you can't do, and also obviously informs them about inefficiencies of hangar space and various other things like that. So it's actually very beneficial, because it sets in stone why you cannot do certain things and have a practical carrier, which then allows them to go, okay, well, if we actually want a full-on aircraft carrier, we're going to have to accept that it can't really do anything else. Admiral Beatty's attempt to turn Eagle into the world's biggest torpedo cruiser aside. And once they've acknowledged that, then they can move forward with what we see now as the more conventional carrier design. So Furious obviously eventually, through its various iterations, ends up being a pure flat top carrier. But it's the lessons from her, and to a certain extent things like Argus as well, that mean that even things like Hermes and Eagle, which are some of the earliest, in Hermes' case purpose designed, and in Eagle's case purposely redesigned ships, are already at the stage where you're seeing pretty much what we'd recognise as a conventional carrier form. Whereas with some other countries, it takes them a little while to cotton on to this. So Akagi and Kaga, for example, obviously built by Japan, it takes a refit later on to ensure that both of these ships are operating with islands. And you even see that with Rugio, again, no island. And the various trunking and funnel issues, you even see this with things like Ranger, and the persistent, actually, attempts in US carrier design to keep eliminating the island. It has its advantages, but they're generally not outweighed by the disadvantages. Mitch Watson asks, why did Allied and Axis navies make little effort to capture enemy merchant shipping in the Mediterranean theatre instead of just sinking it, considering how tight supplies were for both sides in Malta and the North Africa campaigns? If you're going to allow the crew to get off before you sink the ship, as sometimes happens, it doesn't seem like much more effort to put a small crew aboard to sail to a friendly port. Partly it's to do with the issues surrounding capturing a merchant ship. Unlike cruisers of the old style, i.e. ships assigned to a cruising mission, most cruisers, destroyers, etc. that were doing these kinds of convoy raiding missions in the Mediterranean did not carry additional crew to form prize crews. So they just didn't have the men in the first place. And to put a prize crew on made up of the ship's normal crew would shorthand the ship itself, which is not a good thing in such an active combat environment. Secondly, and related to that, if word gets around that this is what's happening, then it's not really that difficult for a merchant crew that's being allowed to leave the ship in a calm and orderly manner to sabotage it in such a way as to either make it inoperable or to actually get it irrevocably on the way to sinking. The other factor is that a lot of these attacks, because there weren't that many solo merchant ships sailing around the Mediterranean were against convoys. So you might go in and shoot up a convoy and be able to sink or badly damage a bunch of ships, but the escorts are going to have something to say about it. And if you are substantially stronger than the escorts are going to probably call in their friends who are going to have something even more to say about it. So it's almost like a shoot and scoot mission. You don't have the time to pull up next to a merchant ship and drop off a prize crew, even if you had one. The other matter is where these engagements are happening. So with an engagement happening on, say, the Italy to North Africa convoy route, well, that's going to be taking place in range of German and Italian air cover. And vice versa, British air cover as well, I guess, based off of Malta. But that means if you, let's say you somehow manage to capture this merchant ship and you're taking it off to whichever port that you want, someone's going to report that, and you now have a minimal crew aboard an enemy merchant ship that you don't necessarily know 100% how to operate, but you do know is very slow compared to a warship and hilariously unprepared to defend itself from air attack if it's wandering around on its own. And if you've got the one ship that captured it wandering around on its own, it's also sort of escorting it, then it's limited in speed, and it's also a pretty good target for mass air attack. So the chances are you probably end up losing the ship you just captured with some of the men you put aboard it, and worst case scenario, you also lose the ship that did the capture if it's trying to run escort. And the flip side is kind of true for the Axis forces trying to potentially capture Allied merchant shipping. If you look where the majority of Allied merchant shipping was, it would have either been within range of Allied air power or within interception range of other Allied warships. So the Mediterranean theatre is effectively just too small to try that in any substantial numbers. Brian Nicholas asks, could you post a basic list of books you consider interesting and well worth the read as regards naval development in the pre-dreadnought and later eras, and of various topics appealing to us as naval history fans? I'm kind of old school and enjoy reading actual books. Well, comment below if you think this is a good idea. I'm quite happy to try and put together a basic list of reference books covering various topics. I mean, you've got, as you say, pre-dreadnought era, ironclad era, World War I, World War II, etc. For the period that the channel largely covers, and maybe dipping a little bit into the Age of Sail. If people would like me to put together a short list of books I'd recommend reading, I'm perfectly happy to do that. The only caveat that I would put on that, however, is that I will only list books that I have either read or that people I trust have read and reviewed very, very highly. So you may look at the list and go, oh, hang on, Drac, but surely this book by this author is really, really good on the subject and should be on there. And you may very well be right. But if I haven't read it, then I can't, in good conscience, recommend it. Even though it might be like a 99.9% chance that it's actually a brilliant book. It's just the way I work. I wouldn't want to say, oh yeah, sight unseen, sure, buy that. Then again, as probably aware, there are an awful lot of books around here, and I do have a few other naval history friends who have also read an awful lot of books, so I think it should be a fairly comprehensive list. So yeah, if you'd like me to do that, I'm happy to do that. I probably would put it up on the website, because then I can update and revise it, add pictures, links to where you can acquire them, etc., etc. So yeah, it's over to you guys if you think this is a good idea. Not Shaped for Sportive Tricks asks, near the end of the Great War, the Royal Navy started building flying-off platforms over the guns of super-firing turrets on some of its battleships. How would this work in combat? Were they disassembled before action, or were the guns fired with them in situ? The first option sounds slow and clumsy. The second seems like it could do some serious damage to the guns, not to mention the Sopwith pup sitting on top of them. Having large bits of timber being blasted about the ship doesn't sound like very health and safety compliant behaviour either. They were removable in theory, but in practice they almost certainly wouldn't have been before battle, because at the point that you're actually going to be launching said aircraft, you've probably not got that long before you're going to be involved in a fight, and the last thing you want is a bunch of the ship's crew crawling over somewhere exposed like the top of a super-firing turret when the shells start to fall. Now, there is some caveat to that. One is that from the side, it looks like these platforms run all the way along the length of the guns. That's not actually true. The platform sits above the turret. The structure that you see above the guns is actually a pair of rails, which are designed just to keep the aircraft at the correct launching attitude. And sometimes you'll actually even see pictures of ships so equipped with the guns pointing up, because these rails are not directly attached to the flying off platform. So the guns can still move up and down and all over the place, etc., without disturbing the aircraft. As far as the blast is concerned, it could be a problem, depending on the exact alignment of the turrets and so forth. But generally speaking, it's not too much of an issue, especially as aircraft start to get slightly stronger. You may remember a few dry docks ago I talked about sort of where it's safe to stand with relative to the blast of guns. And you notice that sort of the majority of the lethal pressure area is forward of the gun muzzles, and although there is a lethal area behind the gun muzzles, it sort of almost pear-shaped. The profile is a lot shorter, so standing next to the guns, for example, as in next to the turret, might not be tremendously good for you, but is not going to be lethal. And also, when these platforms are being put in, the guns we're talking about are usually smaller than the sort of 16-inch and 15-inch guns for the most part. Obviously, something like Renown already has 15-inch guns, but as a result, generally the blast wave effects are slightly less, because guns are slightly less powerful. So if it's well built and the aircraft is kept far enough back, there might be some minor damage, but the actual overpressure at the back of the turret, which, bear in mind, is going to be some dozen feet away from the actual sort of barrel of the gun and the muzzle of the gun where all the blast is going to be coming from, it's probably not going to get too badly torn up, if at all. You'd be quite surprised in that respect. I mean, you wouldn't want to be there, but aircraft and land and takeoff platforms and such don't have to worry about things like deafness and having clothes ripped off, although canvas or wood biplane, you might need to patch up a little bit. Ibby Plays 32 asks, why were the Germans so keen on sending heavy forces without proper enough destroyer and light cruiser escort, and why, when they sent them with them, did they almost all break up and go so far away from the ship that needs escort, like the case with Scharnhorst? It's a whole combination of factors. One of which was that, well, after Norway, the Germans just didn't have that many destroyers left. And bearing in mind destroyers and other similar escort vessels, they have other things to do than just sort of play nursemaid to the big capital ships. So with those other roles being taken up by the destroyers they've got left, they just flat out weren't that many to escort the heavy cruisers and battleships. On top of that, you've got the issue that a lot of the larger long-range German surface deployments were for commerce raiding in the Atlantic, for which destroyers, which are notoriously short-range, are not the best things to be using, especially since a number of the German destroyers had so many issues with stability that they couldn't use a certain percentage of their fuel because they were using that fuel as liquid ballast to stop themselves from flipping upside down. So using destroyers for that kind of long escort mission, say escorting the Scharnhorst or Bismarck, it's just flat out not going to work. They can't last long enough. Although when Bismarck and Prince Eugen were heading off on their mission, they were escorted by destroyers up to Norway, and then the destroyers turned back whilst the two ships were on their way over to the Denmark Strait. As far as light cruisers were concerned, well, again, the Germans didn't have that many to start with. They lost some in the campaign in Norway, much like they did with the destroyers. And as I've said before, the Königsbergs were not in any way, shape or form suitable for sort of high-speed, rough-weather Atlantic travel. It's just not a good idea. They've theoretically got the range to go a bit further, but they're so lightly built and unstable that, yeah, there's a reason they basically spent most of the war in the Baltic. And then on the few occasions where they actually do go out with destroyer screens, so you've got, say, the Battle of Barents Sea, Battle of the North Cape, etc., at that point, you have a combination of two factors. One, again, just low numbers of Kriegsmarine surface ships generally mean that the destroyers have to pull considerably more duty in sort of a detached scouting role, which in a larger fleet might be done by, say, a cruiser, whereas in, say, the Battle of Barents Sea, the cruisers are the centerpiece of the formation. And especially when you're talking about the sort of Norway Arctic area, which is where most of the German large destroyer action is seen during the mid and late part of the war, they are big enough and mean enough and heavily armed enough on paper that people think about using them to directly attack the convoys as well. And also because usually these attacks are going in very bad weather, which serves just as much to conceal their approach as anything else. But it also means that the Luftwaffe can't really do the aerial recon part that well, which means that the destroyers are having to do the recon. So they're going out looking for things. And in the case of, say, the Battle of the North Cape, Scharnhorst finds the escorts for the convoy. The destroyers have gone off on the wrong direction, so they don't find anything and they can't get back in time because, again, the rough weather. So there's a whole combination of factors that mean that the Germans really luck out. And, I mean, Barents Sea is just a mess, quite frankly. But they're trying to do too much with too little, is basically the problem that they've got. And as a result, the destroyers end up being pulled all over the place by various needs and usually end up out of position when it comes to a full-on fight. The German, quote-unquote, torpedo boats, which are effectively small destroyers, as well as some of the German larger destroyers, do have quite a bit of fun in the Channel and the Bay of Biscay area. And there, where they actually get to, operate in squadrons and operate as you might actually classically want to use destroyers, they do tend to enjoy a bit more success. 154 Kilroy asks, a bit of an odd question, what do you think the role of submarines might have been in either World War, assuming that torpedoes had never been invented? And what do you think the Navy as a whole might look like? Now, it's a very important distinction as to whether you mean torpedoes, period, haven't been invented, or just submarine-launched torpedoes. Because if torpedoes, period, haven't been invented, everything changes massively. But, I mean, either scenario applies to the submarine itself. So the role of submarines, I think, would probably split into two very, very distinct categories. You would have submarine mine layers, which would, it's self-explanatory what they do. They're very good at being sneaky and laying minefields close to the enemy shore, where perhaps a surface ship wouldn't necessarily survive. And then you'd have the cruiser submarine, or what eventually became to be called the cruiser submarine, like HMS X1 here, because if the submarine doesn't have a offensive weapon system like a torpedo, then its only other recourse is guns, because mines are obviously a somewhat static weapon. And you'd probably see a lot more of these in the smaller navies, because the whole point is to be sneaky and to then obviously pop up and attack enemy shipping. But if you have to pop up and engage enemy shipping with guns, then for a larger navy that's defending the shipping, like, say, the Royal Navy in the First World War, the US Navy perhaps in the Second, it actually probably makes more sense just to build convoy escort style cruisers instead of your own cruiser subs, because the cruisers will be able to go further, faster, probably be more heavily armed, and obviously a lot more viable against surface raiders as well as submarines that are popping up, who then the cruiser submarines' main utility, to say, is stealth in sneaking past the initial blockade, and then once they're out at sea, sneaking up on convoys from a reasonably advantageous position or lying in wait for them, basically getting the drop on them. There may be a third possibility that I can see developing, which would be kind of a scout recon style sub, which would probably be fairly small, fairly nippy, and probably either unarmed or very, very minimally armed, maybe with a couple of like emergency mines strapped to external launchers on the back to discourage pursuit. And then its main role would be to sneak into or near enemy bases, do recon, possibly act as a kind of tripwire for fleets, because without the need to carry lots of heavy torpedoes and torpedo launchers and such like, then they might be able to get a sub that can, in some ways, probably resemble a lot of those narco boats you see around these days. So it might spend a lot of its time semi-submerged with some ability to go fully submerged, with the idea of it running around being a very low visibility scout. And if torpedoes completely haven't been invented, then the need for torpedo boats aren't going to exist for obvious reasons, but therefore the need for destroyers probably isn't going to come about at all. You will probably then see some kind of destroyer-esque vessel emerge as a submarine hunter, submarine chaser, but it's going to look very different to a destroyer of what we normally think of as the timeline, because obviously without torpedoes, a good chunk of its main offensive armament isn't there anymore. So you'll probably see submarine hunter chasers which are on the much smaller side of things than the average destroyer, so they might be sort of 500 to 1,000 tons. And then you'll probably see a whole series of, as I said, sort of commerce protection cruiser style vessels, so something in the 4,000 to 6,000 ton range, which are big enough and mean enough to take on subs when they're surfacing to use their guns, but also small enough, fast enough, and quick enough to actually hunt them with depth charges and such like. The loss of the torpedo as a weapon is also going to have a huge effect on ship design, because one, they don't need to bulge ships, they don't need to install massively complicated torpedo defense systems, which is going to make armor layout on battleships and cruisers so much simpler, and there's going to be a lot more reserve displacement left to use for other things like, guns and armor plate. So overall, surface ship actions will probably become a lot more lethal a lot faster, because without the need for this additional side protection, you're going to see more weight put into speed, armor, firepower as regards surface engagements. There will still need to be a degree of underwater protection, because mines and things like that, but nowhere near as much as the extensive systems developed for anti-torpedo defense. Kellogg Swag asks, how was Barham allowed to get repaired in the United States after Crete, as the US was still neutral? Well, here's her sister ship Warspite being refitted in Puget Sound. Now, yes, America was neutral, but America was neutral with a fairly strong tendency towards siding with the Allies. So there's that. So the US government would be a lot more prepared to look the other way a little bit, and, these kind of neutrality convoy escort patrol things, as compared to what they'd do if, say, a German ship showed up in New York Harbor and was like, oh yeah, can we have a refit, please? The other aspect of it was that money talks. There was a certain degree of good business to be done repairing, refitting and upgrading the British warships. Now, there's also some rather interesting fine points of international law regarding neutral countries as stood at 1939 through 1945. One of which was that the neutral country wasn't compelled to exclude or restrict warship movements from a belligerent power. All it was compelled to do, as far as setting its own rules and regs, was to apply that equally to both sides. So, theoretically, if they were happy to repair and refit Barham or Warspite or whoever, in theory, if a German ship showed up with the cash to repair it, get itself repaired and refitted, as long as there was a shipyard to take it, technically speaking, it could get away with it. I suspect some other reason for rules luring your way around that would have been found. But there are also a number of other little get-outs, which are very much, you're technically correct, kind of issues, such as all of these restrictions apply to ships that are in the neutral nation's waters. Well, of course, if you put a ship into dry dock, it's no longer in the water, is it? So, very technically, by the letter of the law, the rules on neutrality don't apply. And, of course, there's other things such as the famous regulation that was the British first used to try and get Greif to come out, and then urged the neutral country in question to ignore, so that Greif would stay in as long as possible, with regards to only having a certain and limited stay. But that ran with the caveat of unless it needs further time to make itself repaired and seaworthy. And, well, if it just so happens that within the first 72 hours of a warship arriving in neutral waters, it's gone into a dry dock and has had various bits of it stripped off, so it now no longer is seaworthy, well, then clearly it has to stay long enough to make it seaworthy. And if that happens to involve US shipyards getting quite rich from completely refitting and upgrading the ship and putting patches over it, well, it is a good day to be Puget Sound Naval Yard, or Bremerton technically, etc., etc. So you can twist the international law into a pretzel and eat it if you really, really fancy doing so. Thomas Embleton asks, would the Queen Elizabeths and R-class have been able to take the 15-inch 45 caliber Mark II gun if it had been built? And yes, I'm using HMS Monarch from World of Warships because the 15-inch 45 Mark II was only ever a conceptual weapon, and so there are obviously no photos of a gun that was never made, whereas Monarch is in-game a theoretical representation of one of the early King George V design studies, which would have used 9 of them in 3 triple turrets. So that's why it's there. Getting back to the question, surprisingly enough, the answer is yes. The general assumption at the time seems to have been that, at least to start with, the new 15-inch gun would use the same shells as the Queen Elizabeths and R's and Renowns and Hood were using in the 1930s, i.e. the new advanced Cardinal-type shells. So they wouldn't have had to change their magazine and ammunition hoist requirements. The gun itself was actually going to come in slightly lighter than the 15-inch 42 due to advances in metallurgy and construction, using a slightly different construction method. So even though it was 3 calibers longer, it was something like 6 or 7 tons lighter. So there wouldn't have been any stability issues. In fact, completely wholesale replacing the 8 guns on the Queen Elizabeths and the R's with 15-inch 45s would actually have ended up saving about 60 to 70 tons in weight, which would have been interesting. A few more anti-aircraft guns you can fit for that. The only potential issue would be that, obviously, being a slightly longer gun, its centre of balance is going to be slightly different. So the actual mountings may have needed to be modified, and the gun pits for when the gun's elevated. But it would have taken a surprisingly little work to get the QEs, the Rs, and to say in theory even Hood and Renown and Repulse to take 15-inch 45 Mark IIs had they actually been made. Whether or not that would have been a cost-effective measure to undertake is an entirely different question, beyond whether or not it's physically possible to do. But yeah, I don't see any particular reason why it couldn't have been done. I mean, they would obviously also have to completely reprogram the fire control tables, because the ballistics of the thing would be completely different as well. But such is life. Graham Andrew asks, looking at the fantastic model of HMS Warspite, I noticed that even after the 1943 modifications, there's still an external bridge exposed to the elements. I also note your comments with British naval commanders not using conning towers. What on earth was it with the Royal Navy during World War II that they insist on exposed bridges? It's not like they need to be outside. In fact, surely communicating with other parts of the ship would be more difficult in the wind and in the noise of battle. There's two primary factors, and you see this when you look at HMS Belfast as well, albeit this she is in her post-refit condition as far as bridge structure goes, but similar thing. Basically, it's much easier to see from an open bridge. And on top of that, obviously the open bridge being the lighter bridge and, not having a ceiling above it will be on top, which means it's going to be higher, and a higher viewpoint is generally better for commanding. So having the open bridge has those two advantages. You can see further, and you can also see a lot easier, rather than even a enclosed bridge with windows. You still have a more restricted field of view, and it's more difficult to get around to that field of view. And there's a small potential hazard, I guess, of if shells land nearby and the glass shatters, there's flying splinters and everything. They'll be flying metal splinters anyway from a shell burst, but possibly slightly fewer than if the windows are shattered as well. So that's why the open bridge is there, but there usually would be an enclosed bridge, the deck below. So if the weather was really bad, you could go down there and command from there. Yeah, in theory you might have some issues commanding and commentating, but actually you'd be surprised, even in the middle of what you might think of as a hectic naval engagement, the times where you have the noise of incoming shells, exploding shells, guns firing, etc., are actually proportionally still relatively low compared to the total amount of time the engagement lasts. I mean, if your guns are firing once every 45 seconds to a minute, and the enemy's doing roughly the same, then there'll be maybe a 3-4 second period when you can't do anything on the open bridge because, gun blast. And there might be a similar amount of time when the enemy shells come in. But so that means for, let's say, your average minute, you can't communicate for maybe 10 seconds of that. So 50 seconds of it you can. And if you're in an enclosed bridge, that's only going to add an extra second or two in both the instances to your communications periods, because it's still going to be very noisy. So you would generally find that various bridge crew would be on both the open and enclosed bridges. It's just that because of the additional command advantages of the open bridge, that's where you see most of the photos, although there are a significant number taken from the enclosed sections as well when the weather's not particularly nice. Glenn Ricafrente asks, I once read in Walker Royal Navy that German guided anti-ship missiles could be thwarted by turning on electric razors, leading to a run on electric razors in British shops. How much of this is true? Now, I scoured high and low trying to find any information one way or the other, because it does sound like a fantastic little story. However, eventually, turning to the niche books I have upstairs, I found one called The Applications of Radar and Other Electronic Systems in the Royal Navy in World War II, an almost Victorian length title by one F.A. Kingsley. And yeah, it's very interesting. Actually, he has another book that's about the history of radar devices in the Royal Navy, so they're a companion set. One's the history, one's the applications. But I'm just going to read the paragraph because it pretty much can't be improved upon. So this is talking about the 2nd Support Group, an anti-U-boat hunting group that was operating in the Bay of Biscay. And they've already been attacked at least once by these HS-293 guided missiles. Okay, so paragraph begins. Later that month, an escort in the same group was also attacked by a glider bomb, now dubbed Chase Me Charlie, by the group. Fortunately, on XG2 Section's advice, an order had been promulgated that, as a short-term expedient in all ships under imminent threat of attack by HS-293 or FX-1400, all personnel aboard who possessed electric razors were to proceed rapidly to deck level, activate their razors from the nearest suitable power point, and hold up the device at arm's length. The objective was a crude attempt at jamming the missile control system by the electrical noise radiated from the virtually unscreened razors of that era, albeit at uncomfortably close range. In this latest attack, an officer was able to follow the instruction. To the amazement of the ship's complement, and presumably the enemy aircrew, the ploy worked and the glider bomb went completely out of control before disappearing. Escorts who sailed in Chase Me Charlie areas found the XG2 solution foolproof albeit temporarily, see later on, and in Liverpool there was a sudden run on shops selling various types of electric razor. Similar instances of the application of razor jamming in other operational areas are not known, but at least XG2 instruction had some psychological value and created not a little amusement. So yes, it would appear that through the glorious mechanism of completely unshielded electric motors whirring away in their dozens, you could actually create a crude missile jamming system for, at least when you're under attack by HS-293s, which is highly amusing because can you imagine the face of the aircrew if they could, of the German bombers, if they were actually still looking at their target? They fire this missile, this pride of German technology, brand new homing weapon, and the response of the Royal Navy ship in question isn't anti-aircraft fire or radical manoeuvres or anything. It's like all the crew just ran out on deck, start fiddling around with power sockets, and then are all standing there with one arm raised, almost as if they're like a bunch of Jedi Padawans trying to use the Force to collectively stop this incoming missile. And then, to cap it all off, the missile just goes completely haywire and dives off into the ocean. World War II is full of all sorts of interesting surprises. Matt Osborne asks, why, given perfect intelligence of the commerce raider Greif's position via her own signals, did the Admiralty send the auxiliary cruiser Alcantra, her exact equal, to intercept her alone in 1916? Even a single destroyer, HMS Munster, was able to finish off Greif, whereas Alcantra sank alongside her enemy. Was it just the strange British need to make any engagement as much of a fair fight as possible, or the thin state of British blockade assets that led to this undercard match? Who or what should we blame for this partial defeat being snatched from the jaws of a potential complete victory? Essentially, it's a mixture of luck and skill on the part of the Greif, or Greif, or however the heck you pronounce it. But what happens was I'm going to call it Greif for the minute. Anyway, Greif left Germany, and the Admiralty knew this because it had the signal. As you said, intercepted the signals, so it knew that it was leaving. Jellicoe, in turn, was informed, and Jellicoe actually dispatched quite a powerful force, multiple cruisers and destroyers, to go and intercept it. But although they knew it had left, and they knew roughly what direction it was heading in, they didn't know where along the British blockade line it was going to cross. Again, as you mentioned, later on it did signal, so they got another bearing on where it was at that point, but all that did was narrow it down to a window where Greif might cross the blockade line. And so the cruisers and destroyers were sweeping in an arc through that area trying to find it, but as it so happened, Alcantra and her sister ship Andes were in the vicinity. They were the standard ships on the blockade line, and they were the ones who actually spotted Greif first. Greif was doing a very good job of pretending to be a Norwegian ship, and in particular pretending to be a Norwegian ship that the Germans knew had recently sailed. So by pretending to be that, she was actually able, much like Cormoran and with Sydney in the Second World War, to sucker Alcantra into close range and to send off a boarding party. Then, of course, Greif got the drop on Alcantra, opened fire, Alcantra returned fire. You have this brutal slugging match between two converted merchant ships, specifically liners, in the middle of the ocean at very, very short range, and both ships end up going down. Andes is only about 9,000 yards away at one point, but although it eventually, as it tries to close, eventually manages to open fire, it just shows the difference between warships and merchant ships. Without any kind of large rangefinders or significant fire control systems, even at 8,000 yards, Andes has to close before offering even the most notional or supporting fire, whereas if we were talking warships, that would have been comfortable range for a cruiser to engage at. The destroyer and cruiser, so Munster and Comus, that show up and finish off the Greif, they are nearby, and when they hear what's happening, when they hear there's a suspicious ship that Alcantra is closing in on to try and pull over and board, they head in that direction. They just can't get there in time to help the Alcantra in time. So, yeah, it wasn't a case of them deliberately sending Alcantra to its doom. It was just a case of, well, it was in that place at that time and ended up being the first ship on the scene, if you like. And I mean, on paper, Alcantra has 2 more guns. Greif's carrying 4 5.9s. The Alcantra's carrying 6 6-inches, and it's also about 55% greater displacement at full load than Greif, so it's bigger and it's more heavily armed in guns at least. But at these kind of close range firefights, as is persistently shown in the age of steam and steel, when you get to very, very close range fights, a lot of those kinds of things don't matter so much as who hits who first. John Plusianik asks, can you say a few words about the development and use of large caliber mortars in naval warfare, such as those found on Corregidor? Well, it's just as well you specified the ones at Corregidor, otherwise I would have gone off on a very long and possibly interesting tangent about naval mortars in the age of sail. But the naval mortar of the late 19th century kind, which is the type that you're referring to, was a relatively short-lived kind of coastal defence weapon. And the reason for this was that they were getting increasingly worried with the sheer power of naval artillery in the latter part of the 19th century, that perhaps having a fixed or turntabled gun or guns in coastal fortifications firing in a direct mode was not necessarily such a good idea, because if you could be seen, you could be killed, and bearing in mind this is the late 19th century, so long-range fire control isn't really a thing. Both sides are pretty much going to be engaging at very close ranges. And so they tried a variety of things. They tried disappearing mounts. Those came in the late 19th century. But one of the other things they went back to was the good old mortar, because, of course, a mortar is an indirect fire weapon. So you don't need to have the gun have a line of sight to the target, or a near enough line of sight to the target. Basically, it can be hidden away in a gun pit. And this has one of the single biggest advantages of the fact that you can then make that gun pit have solid walls, massive earth embankments, and possibly even more fortified walls on the outside, which means that the enemy ship doesn't know where that mortar is exactly, and even if it tries to just shoot up the general vicinity, it's not going to get through all those defences, and it can't drop shells into the gun pit because its guns are firing on a far flatter trajectory. So the mortar can just fire away completely and utterly immune to return fire. The disadvantage, of course, is that mortars have a shorter range because their rounds fly in a higher arc for a given muzzle velocity, but that doesn't matter quite as much in the late 19th century because, as I said, no central fire control, range finding systems, etc. So the engagement is taking place well inside a mortar's operational range. The added advantage of the mortar was that if you fired this armour-piercing shell high up into the air and it came down, pre-dreadnoughts not known for their thick deck armour, and these would be dropping in far steeper than even very, very long-range 30,000 plus yard shot would be in a naval engagement of the Second World War. So they would almost certainly smash through the deck of their target, penetrate deep into the ship, and explode, hopefully, in the engines or the engine room or the magazines. Now, this is all well and good in theory, but it ran into a couple of problems in practice. Firstly, because of that very high arc, the mortar projectiles take forever to get to their target, which, even at close range, does give the target some opportunity to maneuver. And secondly, because they're dropping down, not vertically, but closer to vertical than horizontal, it means that the target shadow, i.e. the area wherein, if it's aiming within hitting within this area it will actually hit the target, is very small. It's basically almost the same size as the overhead silhouette of the ship, whereas if you're firing in a more direct mode, if your shot would have impacted the sea where the target is, then obviously you're going to hit, but equally you could hit just a fraction short and still hit. But critically also, if you were aiming in such a way that had the target not been there, your shell would have gone long, depending on the exact angle, you would still hit. Just how far long would be the controlled factor for when your gun is at a fixed angle or a given angle. So this, between the slow flight time and the long flight time and this gun shadow issue, the mortars were not as accurate. It was hoped that, well, the fact that you've just got all the time in the world to keep on firing, and you can have spotters obviously spotting you full of shot, would allow you to improve your rate of fire, and of course the impact of one of these would be devastating, hopefully. The main thing that did them in, though, was while they were still trying to work out all these issues, the range finding and central fire control revolution came along, and ranges just started getting longer and longer, which meant that ships could now engage forts well out of range of the mortars. Or if some of the bigger, more powerful mortars were still in range, the shell flight times were just so hilariously long it was basically pointless. And so they became a quickly developed but also very quickly dying out type of weapon, although there are still a large number of them around in various surviving coastal fortifications. Matt Kidd asks, what class of anti-aircraft weapon was deadliest in World War II? For example, what was the breakdown of kills between 20mm Oerlikon, 40mm Bofors and 5-inch 38 on US warships? Well, it's an almost impossible question to answer, to be perfectly honest, but you asked for the figures for the US Navy. Bear in mind, this is the US Navy's estimates at the time of the end of the war, so exact kills may not be accurate, but they reckoned that for the entire period of their involvement in the war, the 5-inch common anti-aircraft shell accounted for 342 aircraft shot down. The 5-inch VT, proximity fuse, accounted for 346.5 aircraft shot down, and half a kill shared with something. So 5-inch 38 and 5-inch 25 caliber guns accounted for 688.5 aircraft. The 3-inch 50 caliber weapon accounted for 87.5 aircraft. The 40mm Bofors 742.5 aircraft. The 1.1-inch a mere 44.5 aircraft. 20mm Oerlikons 617.5, 50 cal machine guns 65.5, and a few mad lads were out there with 30 cal machine guns and managed to score 4 kills, albeit it did take 112,506 rounds expended in order to take those 4 aircraft down. So your immediate takeaway from that would be, in sheer numbers, the 40mm Bofors is the most lethal. But then you take into account there's an awful lot more Bofors on a given ship than there are 5-inch guns. So does that make the 5-inch the most lethal? Possibly. And you've got to take into account the 5-inch has far more time to engage enemy aircraft. So given that it's got very, very short range of engagement, but still has a fair number of kills, so the 20mm is the most deadly. Well, this is the problem. This is why it's so difficult to determine. On top of that, you've also got what they call the rounds per bird. How many rounds does it actually take to kill an aircraft? And the US Navy report does actually point out that the number of rounds expended to kill an aircraft goes up quite considerably as the war goes on. You might think, hang on a minute, that's not right. Mark 37s, radar, VT fuses, surely the number of rounds expended should have gone down. But the report points out that there are a lot more guns on all of the ships, which meant there were a lot more guns firing at any given aircraft, and equally there are a lot more ships firing at any given aircraft in the latter part of the war. The Japanese were going more and more into night attacks, where obviously fire control is less accurate. Enemy aircraft were getting faster, more agile, better protected, etc. And more doctrine was calling for engagement further and further out, where of course accuracy is considerably less. Plus, as they point out, there were a fair number of anti-aircraft crews out there who were fairly green. So you can see the rounds per bird for taking out an enemy aircraft. 508 rounds for a normal 5-inch shell. Only 155 rounds were needed from the VT firing 5-inch gun to take down an aircraft. That compares to 1,320 rounds in 1943 for 40 mil, 6,000 rounds, just over 6,000 for 20 mil. It goes up, so by the time of 1945, it's taking just over 600 rounds of normal 5-inch high explosive, or 366 rounds of proximity fused, or 1,508 rounds of 40 mil, or 4,398 rounds of 20 mil. So, of all of those, the one that's actually suffered the least increase is probably actually the 40mm Bofors. And then, of course, you've got to factor in things like rate of fire, because although the 5-inch gun is using fewer rounds to kill an aircraft, it can't fire anywhere near as fast as a Bofors. So if you want to kill X number of enemy aircraft within Y amount of time, you have to multiply all of that out, which complicates things again. And then you've got also the fact that kamikaze aircraft are going up in the latter part of the war. And again, one of the other parts of the report shows that something around 3/4 of kamikaze aircraft that made it into the US Navy's aircraft anti-air envelope were shot down, as opposed to only about just over 20% of non-kamikaze aircraft for around the same time period. Partly because the kamikaze aircraft got a lot closer, but partly also because they're coming straight at you, which makes it a considerably easier target than an aircraft that's flying at high speed crossways past you. So you have to factor all of these things in. Generally speaking, I'd be tempted to put my finger on the 40mm Bofors as the single most lethal dangerous effective anti-aircraft weapon, because it's, well, as you've seen from the anti-aircraft guns video, it captures the medium anti-aircraft spot quite convincingly, and there's a lot more of them, so you're likely to run into a 40mm Bofors in places where you might not run into a 5-inch 38, and it's got that longer range than the Oerlikon, so it's going to be engaging a lot more aircraft in its bubble. So yeah, that would be my feeling. The 40mm Bofors is probably sort of rate of return for shells fired in terms of aircraft shot down. But as you probably gathered from that, there's an awful lot of calculations that will need to be done to try and prove it one way or another scientifically. And of course, that is assuming that the numbers of aircraft shot down and who they're attributed to are actually accurate. And finally for this week, Nickboy302 asks, can you describe the Japanese naval districts and what was the relative importance of each of them, such as Kure Naval District? So Japan, in the time of the Pacific War, World War II, had 5 major naval districts: Kure, Maizuru, Sasebo, Yokosuka, and Ominato. And I'm sure I've got at least 50% of those pronounced wrong. Nevertheless, of those, Yokosuka and Kure were probably the 2 biggest and most important yards. Sasebo and Maizuru were probably slightly more important towards the beginning of the Japanese Navy's division of everything up into naval districts, because they faced west towards China, Korea, Russia, etc. But by the time of World War II, when the focus was now over looking east and south, Kure and Yokosuka, which also had most of the big cities in them, were more important. However, of the 2, I think Kure was probably slightly more important than Yokosuka, even though Yokosuka was labelled the first district and Kure was second. And I say that for a few reasons. Within the boundaries of Kure Naval District, you had the Japanese Navy training establishments, the main submarine base and submarine warfare training. There was also an air training section, and they had pretty much the most advanced shipyards that the Japanese possessed. So everything from the Amagi through to the Yamato were products of shipyards in Kure, as opposed to anywhere else. And I know some of you are probably thinking, well, if Kure is such a vital and important naval district, then why is the US fleet that's based in the western part of the Pacific not base itself from Kure? Why does it base itself out of Yokosuka? Well, firstly, Yokosuka works somewhat better for the threats that the US Navy these days has to look at. And secondly, and perhaps the most convincing reason as to why Kure was probably the most important Japanese naval district, the Americans bombed Kure a heck of a lot more than they bombed Yokosuka. The vast majority of American airstrikes that were targeted at naval infrastructure went after stuff in the Kure naval district, and as a result of which there wasn't an awful lot of it left at the end of the war, which is somewhat counterproductive to, actually reusing it. So Yokosuka, which was, as I said, almost as important, but slightly more intact, plus being geographically better positioned, ended up being what is now the most important Japanese naval district. And that's all for this week, people. Thank you very much for listening again. Just one or two bits of channel admin. You probably noticed there wasn't the Fan Friday on Dystopian Wars that I wanted to put up. Sorry about that. Various things cropped up during the week. I wasn't able to complete all the painting I wanted to, so I definitely will have everything done for the next Fun Friday, so there's that at least. And the other thing, again, comments below if you'd appreciate it or not. I have noticed over the past few Patreon Drydocks, as the sheer number of Patreon questions has grown and grown, there has been relatively little opportunity outside of the very end of the monthly live streams for me to actually grab questions from the chat. So would people want me to put in a second live stream, maybe in the middle of each month, which would be purely taking questions from chat from the beginning? If you'd like me to do that, let me know in the comment below. If not, then if you'd prefer me to stay just at the once a month live stream, also just let me know, and we'll see how we go from there. All right, thanks very much. Bye.